Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for our agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, May 24th, 2025. We begin with our dear ancestor and Freedom Now founder, Baba Didan Kamathi, bringing us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. Thanks to our friends at Prison Radio, we're going to be bringing you a message from Todd Robinson, sharing his story about his ongoing fight against injustice in the system that breeds it. After that, our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne, will be joined on the line by Sandy Hudson, writer, activist, co-founder of Black Lives Matter Canada, and for our purposes today, she's author of the book Defund: Black Lives, Policing, and Safety for All. Then, in the second half of our program, Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by Judith Weisenfeld, Brown and Collard Professor of Religion at Princeton University in New Jersey, and author of the book Black Religion in the Madhouse: Race and Psychiatry in Slavery's Wake. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure we stay on the smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Black Uhuru, Tony Foster, Larry Fuller, Matt Rawlings, Regina Carter, and the Buena Vista Social Club. Now, people, get ready for this train to come and taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by some prison radio and an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Sandy Hudson. Thanks to our friends at Prison Radio, we're bringing you another message from legendary freedom fighter behind the walls, Mumia Abu-Jamal, entitled The Road to Madness.
From the day I was born and given life, I and I a actor, genius, name it.
Hotep, this is Freedom Now's African Drumbeat Historical Calendar, where we provide a thumbnail overview of significant events and personalities in the historical process for social revolution. May 26, 1799, Alexander Pushkin, an African who is the greatest Russian poet of all times, was born. He was immortalized by the Russian Revolution as a literary revolutionary. Pushkin pioneered the use of vernacular speech in his poems and plays, creating a style of storytelling mixing drama, romance, and satire. May 27, 1964, Tanganyika and Zanzibar unite in the Pan-African spirit to form the East African country of Tanzania. May 28, 1851, Sojourner Truth speaks about the triple oppression of African women facing racism, poverty, and sexism at the Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, New York. Her most famous speech, Ain't I a Woman?, attacked European society for placing white women on a pedestal and giving them privileges while African women were commoditized, raped, brutalized, and sold into slavery. May 24, 1944, Maurice Bishop, leader of the New Jewel movement and architect of the Grenadian Revolution in the Caribbean, was born. The United States subsequently invades Grenada, a country the size of Compton, with Operation Fury to overthrow the government of the New Jewel movement and replace it with a U.S. puppet neocolonial regime. May 30th, 1954, the National Liberation Front of Algeria begins armed struggle against French settler colonialism. After decades of human rights protests, over 1.5 million Algerians and 27,000 French soldiers died in the bloodiest war fought on the African continent. Algeria was a jewel in the French Empire, with over 1 million French relocating to Algeria and occupying the best agricultural lands and controlling businesses. Egypt, under Gamal Abdel Nasser, provided the base for the Algerian Revolution. May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc, the 19-year-old martyr and Catholic heroine, was burned at the stake. She led 6,000 French men to free France from English colonization during the 100-Year War. May 28th, the first century, the Trung sisters, Trac and Nia, led an uprising against Chinese domination of their country, Vietnam. Trac gained the trust of the Vietnamese people by her killing a tiger that was frightening the people in the populous village. She used the tiger's skin as a parchment to write a proclamation urging her people to rise up against Chinese domination. Her sister Nia was a fearless warrior who chose 36 women, including her mother, and trained them to be generals. These women, general, led a people's army of 80,000, including men, which drove out the Chinese in 40 AD. June 1st, 1900, Samori Touré, an African freedom fighter, dies in a French prison. Samori led a long war against French colonial rule in Guinea, West Africa. 60 years later, with his grandson Sékou Touré and the Democratic Party of Guinea, leads the independence movement to free Guinea from French colonial rule. Sékou Touré is one of the co-founders of the modern-day Pan-Africanist movement. June 1st, 1807, the Slave Trade Act was passed, which abolished the slave trade in the British Empire, but not slavery itself. As slave uprising continued to occur throughout the world, slavery itself was abolished by the British Empire in 1833. June 1st, 1970, Libya in North Africa expels the last of 8,000 U.S. troops from Wheelus Air Force Base, thereby concluding the African nationalization of Libya from all foreign forces and multinational oil corporations. June 1st, 1956, Tunisia, a Mediterranean country in North Africa, gains independence under leadership of Habib Bourguiba and the Destor Party. Tunisia is the historical home of the famous Phoenician city of Carthage. Tunisia, though predominantly a Muslim country, practiced religious tolerance where Christians, Jews, and atheists all live in harmony. June 1st, 1975, the George Jackson Brigade, a European support group for political prisoners, bombs the Department of Correction headquarters in Washington State. The George Jackson Brigade was a part of the militant prisoners' right support movement. In its 3 years' existence, it claimed 11 bombings, 10 bank robberies, and targeted the FBI, Bureau of Indian Affairs, corporations, and the Department of Corrections. June 1st, 1919, Red Summer takes off, called red for the blood of Africans that spilled throughout the United States in a massive series of race wars. These pogroms were launched by whites against blacks over a black teenager swimming near the white side of a segregated beach. Over 26 cities and uncounted smaller towns were victimized by the frenzied assault by thousands of whites against black homes, businesses, schools, and churches. Thousands were murdered. This has been the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for Freedom Now. This program can be reheard for the next 90 days by going to kpfk.org under Audio Archive scroll to Freedom Now. Please join us in a unity chant of a mandala awaitu 3 times. A mandala awaitu means we the people are the power. We the people have the power. We the people will be the power.
The road to madness. I think once people have a second thought, they'll realize the gravity and the scope of their mass stupidity. And I hate to put it that way, but sometimes it is what it is. You know, if you elect a fool, you cannot be surprised when you see foolishness. And that's what it is. And this cat is breaking everything in the house. And it's wonderful and terrifying at the same time, because, you know, we must recognize that for the most powerful empire, perhaps in world history, to believe that it has been cheated by the rest of the world instead of the reverse is an example of mass media manipulated delusion. Terrifying, because the pain and suffering that will come from this is probably close to incalculable. It will be in the trillions of dollars. It's as if you took trillions of dollars and burnt it, and just burnt it. That's what's happening. And that's why the business class, the corporate class, are head on fire about this. And they're trying to get through to a blockhead who cannot hear them because his ego is so loud. And so it's terrible, because we're seeing history being made every day, and not in a good way. This is why it's wonderful. Lenin once said, there are years and decades when nothing happens. And there are days when decades happen, when things happen. We're in the middle of a kind of social transformation that we cannot see the end of because of stupidity, because of political ego, and because really of a profound kind of recklessness, right? Like in the last week, $6 trillion just disappeared. Just disappeared. And I am informed when I look at the news and I hear about the bond markets, and for the first time in decades, the bond market, speaking of, treasury bills, so-called T-bills, which may have a 10-year yield, a 30-year yield, or a 50-year yield. For the first time, the number of bonds sold declined in this period. That's remarkable because when the economy is in chaos, which it is, the last place people invest in are T-bills because this is considered a safe security backed by the government. But when that number started to decline, people were looking at the government and saying, I can't trust these people. I am not investing in T-bills. So that suggests that they were long-term investors or even international investors who shifted their currency somewhere else or just declined to buy. That was the danger sign that made Trump go with this 90-day pause. And he heard from some people at the top of the financial heap that moved him. But I think it's too little, too late. In many ways, the damage is done. Because it's of a piece. It's not like one thing. It's of a piece of what's happening politically, economically, in terms of immigrants, the executive orders, they're bordering on madness, the DEI move, all this stuff. It's mindless bullshit, but it's mean. And it has its impact. And people are looking at the United States in ways they have never looked at it in our lifetimes.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Sandy Hudson, writer and activist and co-founder of Black Lives Matter Canada and author of the book Defund, Black Lives, Policing, and Safety for All. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Radio, Sandy Hudson.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book?
Well, I think, during 2020, there was what felt like a lot of support for Black communities, for racial justice, but I felt like there was an obstacle where people were fine to align themselves with this idea of racial justice, but as soon as we came to policies that could actually transform the way that Black people are being unjustly targeted by systems, there would be this reticence to considering these real changes and supporting these real changes. And, we did see some support for defunding the police and reallocating resources to programs and services that would actually create the conditions of safety. But I saw people struggling with the arguments of what it would mean, how we could do it, and why it was necessary. Knowing that there was likely going to be a backlash period, which I would argue we're in right now, or a whitelash period, I wanted to spend the time to get those arguments down in a book that would be targeted towards a broad audience so that people could really understand that not only is this argument rational, but it really is the only way forward to resolving some of these problems that people claim to care about.
What about the origins of policing itself? What do you have to say about that?
That was the most interesting part of writing this book, was doing the research into the origins of policing. And so I name 4 different origins, one being colonialism, one being enslavement, one being to control the working class, and to control them against the people who are the managerial class or business owners. And then finally, to control our morality. And all of that is about control. None of it is about safety. And the sleight of hand of to make policing about safety rather than control is just like an incredible propaganda that's happened that started early in the 1900s. And so really, I think tracing policing back from its modern origins in the late 1700s, you see that really it was created to control indigenous populations, to get them away from their lands, to control where they could be so that settlement could happen in settler colonies like the United States, Canada, and elsewhere. It was to make sure that when you had a population that was enslaved, that was at times more populous than the slave owner population, you needed the tools of torture, of violence, to be able to try to keep people who would otherwise free themselves in their place through horror. And, you know, this was a transition period where people, you know, they were starting to implement the wage as a way that people who were poorer would be able to live their lives, and to make sure that people would accept, you're going to accept this wage and you're going to come to work and you're going to accept these rules that are being set for you by people who have the ability to become enormously wealthy off of your labor. They needed something to control that. And then finally, morality. And that's something that continues to today. So, you know, in the past, it would have been illegal in some places for women to walk the streets alone because that was seen as immoral. Whereas today, certain types of substance use, for example, is seen as immoral, or certain types of work, like sex work or engaging in survival economies, like engaging in the drug trade, for instance, are morally controlled through policing.
You also write that, quote, we've been disinformed, unquote. What does that mean?
Yeah, and to that, I'm really referring to the ways that we really do believe we have been told that policing is about safety. You know, as early as kindergarten, we may be in sessions at school where we're told, you know, all you need to do is call 911 if you're feeling unsafe, and police will come and they'll solve the problem. But that really is a fantasy. 911 itself is a very new phenomenon. It's not something that's been around forever. But this idea that policing is like your own personal hero that is going to solve cases of conflict or issues of unsafety that you might find yourself in is really based off of what people see in entertainment. But when you look at the numbers, a lot of which I detail in my book, policing is failing spectacularly at keeping people safe, at solving issues when it comes to things like theft or arson or robbery. The numbers are dismal. No other public service continues to get increases in funding while failing so spectacularly. And people are stunned when they hear that across the board, whether we're talking about Canada, the United States, or the United Kingdom, less than 4% of police time is spent on issues of crime, is spent on issues of violence and harm. Police don't do what we think they do. But when we watch the evening news and when we watch television, we are fed an idea of what police do that is very, very different than what reality is. And because most of us don't come into contact with police at all in terms of broader society, when compared with other public services like education or healthcare, we all come into contact with education or healthcare. But when it comes to policing, it's more like 20% of society that ever comes into contact with policing. We rely on what we've been told about police. And what we've been told is a mirage that just simply isn't the case.
Now to the question of alternatives. Assemblyman Mamdani of New York City is now running for mayor, and he's suggesting that for many police tasks, consonant with what you just articulated, would be better off in the hands of social workers rather than police officers. And of course, in Eugene, Oregon, they had attempted an experiment in that regard. What inferences do you draw from those particular examples, and what lessons can you share with us regarding experiments in that direction from Toronto?
Yeah, I mean, there's been those experiments, and actually, I think we can go beyond calling them experiments now. Services that have been set up. Some are under threat as we're in this again white lash period. But there's been these programs set up in Eugene and Portland, Oregon, Phoenix, Arizona, in Canada. They've been set up in Toronto, in Calgary, and several different places. Coming from Toronto directly, one of those programs is a 211 program. So there isn't just 911 where you can call in an emergency service to get the police. There's also a 211 program where you can call in an emergency situation where we are faced with a mental health crisis. You can call 211 and get a non-police response. And that has been really, really quite successful. Now, the program in Portland is a really great one because they partnered with the higher education institution to evaluate it, and it's been in place. The broader Portland one, not the one that's in Eugene, but the broader Portland one. I think it's been in place since 2001, so it hasn't been around very long. But the initial reports are very successful. Same with the one in Phoenix. The one in Toronto has also been really successful. And the city council, I think a couple of years ago, decided to make it permanent and to expand it. And we're seeing it expanding to other cities as well. Because we have to know, like, the people who are most likely to be harmed by police include Black communities, include also communities of people who are disabled or who experience a disability, including a mental health disability or mental illness. And so the tools that police have, which again are tools of violence, are not tools that somebody needs when they are going through an emergency health crisis. What the tools that those people need are proper support, resources, care, and potentially treatment. And so what these programs are doing are trying to solve the problem. You know, you can't solve a mental health crisis with a baton, a taser, and a gun, but you might be able to solve it with people who are trained to intervene in that type of crisis. And so I'm glad to see the proliferation of these programs as an alternative.
Now, on the other side of the coin, there's Cop City in Atlanta. What is that, and what do you have to say about it?
Wow, Cop City in Atlanta is such a tragedy. So much money being spent on creating essentially a military base for police to train up on the tactics of violence, to really act as though when they're interacting with the public, they are interacting with an enemy force. And they're doing that on top of, and again, this harkens back to some of the origins of policing, on top of indigenous lands. It's an ecological disaster. They're doing it in grave opposition to the community that lives there, who do not want this, who organized democratically to oppose it to the city council. And even still, they decided to go through with it, in part because of how much money is involved in this project. And again, I just want your listeners to remember, the majority of police time, it's like less than 5% of police time, is dealing with violence and crime. So why would you spend untold amounts of money to create the largest police training center and invite police from all over to come and be trained in these militarized tactics. That is not what we need in our communities to create safety. There are better ways to create safety, but it certainly does look like what one would need if they were trying to create control, coercive control of people. And certainly through Cop City, there's been democratic participation in opposing it, including peaceful protests in which police responded with violence and indeed killing Tortuguita, one of the protesters who was sitting with their hands up from reports that I've seen in the news. And so I detail that incident in the book. And it's just the amount of money that we will spend in communities on the tools of violence, these militarized tactics and policing, rather than on creating safe communities through the things that we really need, things that would provide a safe and predictable life for people. It's just really, really disconcerting.
You are also co-executive producer of the film Black Life, Untold Stories. What does it concern and where can it be found?
Yeah, thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about that. It's a really great project. It's an 8-part documentary series about Black history in Canada and history from as far away as the 1600s to today, really. And it's a wonderful, like each of the 8 episodes focuses on a different topic. And though we're talking about the history of Black people in Canada, that necessarily includes the history of Black people in the United States and the Caribbean, because those histories are so interlinked and interwoven. And it was such a wonderful documentary series. There was a different director for each episode, so it's really like 8 different short films, and it's a really beautiful project. It can be found on the CBC website and CBC GEM, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Finally, Sandy Hudson, author of the book Defund, Black Lives, Policing, and Safety for All. What's next on your agenda?
Well, I want to continue to talk about this issue and try to get it back into the news. I'm writing more and more on this, so I'm hoping to get some more writing out there about this issue. And then I'm also putting a book together of different Black artists across Canada, the Caribbean, and some folks who have some artistry and work in the United States, putting that together into a coffee table volume, a full color art book, because I really do think that imagining a just future for Black people includes the artists, and I want to make sure that work gets out there. And I'm also I've started a film company with my co-producer Rodney DeVerlis, and we're working on a number of different films where we're hoping to inspire social change through stories. And so folks can look out for that work as well.
We certainly will be on the lookout for that work, Sandy Hudson. But thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is our sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Judith Weisenfeld, Brown and Collard Professor in the Department of Religion at Princeton University in New Jersey, and author of the book Black Religion in the Madhouse, Race and Psychiatry in Slavery's Wake. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Radio, Professor Weisenfeld.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you for accepting. And so why did you write this book?
I was working on my previous book, New World A-Coming, Black Religion and Racial Identity During the Great Migration, in which I was exploring the intertwining of religion and race among members and leaders of several Black new religious movements in the Great Migration, one of which was Father Divine's Peace Mission movement, in which followers renounced race in general, and they lived in sex-segregated celibate communes, and it was headquartered in Harlem in the 1930s. And in the course of that research, I came across a set of psychiatric studies of his followers. The family court judge in New York sent several of his followers for psychiatric evaluation. And I became intrigued in reading those studies and writing about them in that context, about what was the larger evaluation of African American religion in the psychiatric profession, because it surprised me to find not only that psychiatrists were writing about Divine's followers in the 1930s in the context of Harlem, but that they were making these broad gestures about how race, religion, and mental normalcy interacted.
So you write about slavery's wake, but what about slavery itself? For example, the phenomenon known as drapetomania.
There is a history of consideration among physicians about a relationship between religion and mental illness for African Americans in slavery, and drapetomania is the key diagnosis that people focus on, created by a doctor named Samuel Cartwright, and he coined the term and the diagnosis to frame the desire for freedom, running away, stealing oneself, as mental illness among enslaved Black people. And he prescribed a treatment of vigorous whipping, and it had to be vigorous because he saw a related condition that he also invented of a kind of hardening of the skin. So whipping had to be vigorous. I think one thing I note in the book is that often people mention this supposed mental illness of desire for freedom and running away, but people often miss that for Cartwright it was deeply embedded in religious ideas. And he writes in his article proposing this condition, that the natural condition of Black people is one of servitude, and he references the curse of Ham in Genesis, and argues that any desire for enslaved Africans to step outside this divinely ordained status of servitude is what makes it a mental illness. So he really set it in a religious context. And so that is a backdrop for the kinds of psychiatric theories that emerge after the end of slavery, but those psychiatrists don't reference the Bible as explicitly as Cartwright did in the earlier period.
So what is meant by the term, quote, religious excitement, unquote?
What I found in my research is that religious excitement became an umbrella term for these late 19th and early 20th century white psychiatrists to talk about the way they felt certain kinds of religious expressions had the potential to create a psychiatric or a mental disorder. And religious excitement was a supposed cause that was available within the diagnostic system they were using of mania and melancholy. So those were the mental illnesses. And psychiatrists looked for different precipitating causes. And some of those could be physical, or an accident where you hit your head, or a medical condition like epilepsy. And other causes they defined were what they called moral causes, and they weren't all religious, but religious excitement was one of them. And while it had been in use in the United States and other contexts in the early 19th century, I found that over the course of the late 19th century, it became increasingly aligned with Black religious expression. And by that, they meant two primary things I found in reading the psychiatric literature and looking at case files. They meant that African Americans, they would say explicitly that the quote unquote the Negro is naturally superstitious, by which they meant their religious practices were oriented towards African traditions like conjure Africana traditions in the US, and that African Americans were overly emotional in their religious expression. And here they framed Black Christianity as kind of insufficiently Christian and potentially destabilizing.
Now, what you referenced thus far deals with the question of how African American modes of spiritual power were degraded. Do you have more to add concerning that point?
So in the late 19th century, this theory is built by a set of white physicians, most of whom work in Southern state mental hospitals, and they produce this theoretical landscape based on their interactions with Black patients. And so in the late 19th century, religious excitement is the primary tool for them to pathologize, Africana spiritualities like conjure and hoodoo and root work, and then to describe Black church worship, the rise of holiness theology and Pentecostalism as similarly disordered. And what really struck me, though, is that when the diagnostic frame changes in the early 20th century, so by the 19-teens and early 20s, psychiatrists are no longer diagnosing people as suffering from acute mania or acute melancholy, but as suffering from dementia precox or manic depressive psychosis, these new disease categories that came into use from a German psychiatrist in the early 20th century. And one could imagine that, the physicians talked about this as a more scientific and rigorous approach. And yet I found that the same presumptions about Black religions as pathological, and as you say, that serve to degrade them, were still in place through this whole new diagnostic system.
Now, what you've outlined thus far represents a critique of the role of psychiatry, which leads me to the question, how was this profession propelled by this encounter with Black people? And are there any implications for today's profession of psychiatry?
I think the authority of psychiatry as a distinct field of medicine coincides with the emergence of formerly enslaved Black people into new arenas of American society. And it seemed to me that this set of what I call kind of self-proclaimed race experts from the South, that they, by theorizing at the intersection of race, African American religion, and ideas about mental normalcy, that they propelled this question of the mental status of African Americans and the civic capacity, the potential to be citizens in slavery's wake. They propelled this question into the emerging field of psychiatry, and they were the experts on this. And they developed these theories and they propagated them through publications in the major medical journals, through lectures at conferences, major conferences. So they, as race experts, as the ones who theorized at the intersection of race, African American religion, and mental illness, they propagated these theories. And I think it's important to see these as coincident, right? They're happening at the same time as coincidences, but not coincidental. And the other thing that was very striking to me as I looked into the backgrounds of this early set of white psychiatrists was how many of them had individual kind of personal investments in slavery or family histories of slavery or had fought on behalf of the Confederacy. So they were not neutral on the question of slavery, and they argued that slavery had been good for African Americans and that freedom was destabilizing. And they were also, by and large, active Protestants in mainstream churches, Baptists, Methodists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians. And it calls to the fore the fact that their ideas about good religion or true religion were at play as well in their evaluations, in their pathologizing of African American religion. And so, the longer term implications for the profession for me, I think have to do in part with recognizing these histories that, certainly there's a lot of work demonstrating that science, medicine, psychiatry have not been neutral on the question of racial hierarchy and ideas about racial capacity. But it's new to think about the role religion played, both ideas about Black religion and the religious orientations of the psychiatrists who developed these theories.
What about the Lafargue Clinic? What was it and what role does it play in your story?
The Lafargue Clinic was a community mental health clinic that was located in the basement of St. Philip's Protestant Episcopal Church in Harlem. And it was founded by the novelist Richard Wright, the German Jewish emigre psychiatrist Frederick Wertham, and Reverend Shelton Hale Bishop, who was the rector of St. Philip's Church. And they came together to provide a space for people to have access to mental health resources. They would have maybe talked about it more as mental hygiene at the time, in a place that was something more than the pastor's study where one might go for some advice or general counseling, more than that and less than institutionalization. And so they were trying to, they were part of a movement at the time to prevent the development of mental illness on a scale that required institutionalization. And they did so because there just were no resources for Black patients. There was very little access to psychiatry. And Wertham had been practicing in Baltimore through Johns Hopkins, and I think he said he was the only psychiatrist in the city of Baltimore at the time who would take Black patients. So he was aware of this gap. And so they developed this clinic, kind of building on some of the earlier work that both a set of Black social scientists and early psychiatrists did to move away from the earlier theory that talked about racial traits and innate superstitions and emotionalism, to turn away from that as an explanation for why people developed mental illness, to thinking about social context, economic stress, lack of access to education, the pressures of racism, things like that. And so the Lafargue Clinic was very cognizant of that turn in the approach to mental health that had taken place in the decade or so before.
Now, just as a follow-up, as I recall, Paul Lafargue, who I assume lent his name to this clinic, was the son-in-law of Karl Marx and was Cuban. Is that accurate? And does naming the clinic after him carry any added significance?
That's correct. They named it in honor of him. I don't think he participated in it. I think it was in honor of a kind of Afro-Cuban who had concerns for well-being in a broad sense. So they named it after him, and the pamphlet they distributed had an image of him on it. And it was not, even though it was located in the basement of a church, it didn't provide religious counseling and didn't approach religious orientations among the patients as any particularly noteworthy element, unless the patient brought it up. So it also represented a turn away from centering religion in the way that some of the earlier psychiatrists had, but to kind of see the whole person and engage religion or sexuality or economics or any other kind of factor as it came up. So the kind of maybe the irony of Marx's son-in-law's name on it and its location in a church is not entirely ironic.
Early on in your book, Professor Weisenfeld, you note similar trends that you describe in your pages in colonial Zimbabwe, i.e. Rhodesia, East Africa, Southwest Nigeria, Jamaica, Trinidad, Brazil. That leads me to wonder if, generally speaking, has psychiatry in many sites played a kind of pro-colonial role or anti-Blackness role, or what inferences should we draw from these parallels?
I benefited from that literature of the work of other scholars who have shown that, and I'm most familiar with the British Caribbean colonial context, but it absolutely the case that psychiatric institutions have been used to contain expressions, anti-colonial expressions, to pathologize the cultural worlds of people seeking freedoms in different times and contexts. And in the British Caribbean in the 19th century, for example, or early 20th century, and I've read some material about Brazil as well in the early 20th century, Black religions, so African originated practices are similarly pathologized in ways that I found in the United States. So in the way that under slavery, certain kinds of practices of conjure, root work, religious expressions like drumming were sources of fear and were targeted for eradication, kind of similar post-emancipation moves, but done through other means, including through medicine and psychiatry. So I think the broader context of how the authority of science, medicine, and psychiatry in particular, how it gets wielded to control and contain and marginalize is very striking, although the different religious manifestations that come into play are also of significance.
Finally, Judith Weisenfeld, author of the book Black Religion in the Madhouse, Race and Psychiatry in Slavery's Wake. What's next on your research agenda?
I have a small project I'm working on right now that is connected somewhat to this book and to some teaching I've been doing on for a course called Cult Controversies in America. I'm interested in how ideas about African American religion help to shape the rise of the idea of brainwashing as something that so-called cults do, and in particular, how the emergence of the practice of deprogramming was also grounded in particular ideas about race, African American religion, and mental capacity, because the father of what came to be called cult deprogramming was Ted Patrick, an African American native of Tennessee, who moved to San Diego and became involved in the anti-cult movement in the 1970s. So I'm doing some work to think again about the place that in this case for me, a kind of unexpected place of African American ideas about African American religion and the role that they played.
Well, Professor Weisenfeld, we look forward to that work as well with eager anticipation. In any case, thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
It was an honor to be with you.
I may not be a movie star. I don't drive no fancy car. I can afford only a Winchester cigar. From the day I was born and given life, I and I a hot top genius, name it.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Sandy Hudson, for coming on to share the work in her book, Defund, Black Lives, Policing, and Safety for All. We'd also like to give thanks to Professor Judith Weisenfeld, representing Princeton University, and her book, Black Religion in the Madhouse, Race and Psychiatry in Slavery's Wake. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best in guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. Special thanks to Prison Radio and Mumia Abu Jamal for coming on and sharing that wisdom with us as usual. Special thanks to our spiritual backbone, Freedom Now founder and ancestor Baba Didan Kamathi on the African Drumbeat historical calendar. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters out there. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to Freedom Now to hear this program, as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.